Really exciting to see such a wonderful group joining us online. We appreciate your support by your attendance here, and hopefully that you will find this to be a truly experience for you that will be helpful in your ministry setting. Today, we want to share and bring to you the subject of researching neighborhoods, practical tools for a prophetic community. And we're extremely delighted to have as our presenter Mike Pears. And Mike is the coordinator of Urban Life, a new center for mission in deprived urban communities. With his wife and family, Mike has lived and ministered in urban situations for over 30 years. So he has quite a bit of experience that he brings to this conversation today. Much of Mike's ministry has been in deprived communities where he has worked at creative approaches to incarnational ministry and church planting. Mike also finds time to serve as tutor at Bristol Baptist College and is the facilitator for urban expression and in partnership with the Baptist Association in Bristol. Mike is currently completing a doctoral degree in mission and urban deprivation. And so it is with great joy to present to you and to invite Mike Pears to share on our topic today of researching neighborhoods, practical tools for a prophetic community. Mike, please join us.
Right, thank you. Well, hi everyone. Good evening or good day, depending on where you are. And just join with Stan there, and thank you for joining us. And thanks, Stan, for that helpful introduction, and for Enton in all the technical support. You guys have been very helpful, so thank you for that. So this is the second of two webinars that mark the launch of Urban Life. Urban Life is concerned with training and education and research for those involved and embedded in incarnational approaches to mission in marginal places. And these two seminars are appetizers for some of the themes that we will be exploring in more depth through our training and research networks. Let's just get my PowerPoints happening here. It has a number of key partners, including the Baptist Union of Great Britain, who provided substantial sponsorship, for which we're very grateful. So this seminar is entitled Researching Neighborhoods, Practical Tools for a Prophetic Community, and is about the important area of research and incarnational mission, and is aimed really at a mission team or intentional Christian community who want to understand more about the place they are in and the implications of that understanding for the way they engage in mission. The same ideas can, of course, be applied in many circumstances, from an individual doing research to a church planting team that's going out to explore a new area for church planting. The thinking I'm sharing with you here has grown out of my own recent experience. I've been involved in urban mission for over 30 years, and in the 1980s we talked about our research in terms of spiritual mapping. So I don't know if anyone listening is involved in that. It was helpful in many ways, but it also had its limitations, and in some cases went off in some rather weird directions. So any feedback from you guys who've been involved in that would be interesting. Over the last 5 years, I've been involved in a small incarnational community in a marginalised part of Bristol. And during that time, we've discovered a great deal about incarnational approaches to research. I don't think as a group that we've necessarily done research very well, and we are not a great model of how to do research, but I hope that we've learned something from our mistakes. Obviously, doing research is a big area, and we can only cover a few things here this evening. However, this seminar is one of the areas that we will be touching in more depth through Urban Life courses, so I hope that it whets your appetite a little bit for that. Move there. Oh, sorry, I've lost my PowerPoint. I don't know, Enton, can you help me get my PowerPoint back?
Sure, Mike. Let me help you with that. But also, we have lost your video. We just have a frozen screen.
Oh dear.
And so I was wondering if we can try to get you back as well.
Okay.
I'll get your PowerPoint back up here momentarily, but
Sorry.
your video is still frozen for us. And so, Mike, I wonder if what we need to do is, if the camera doesn't come out, if we can have you actually close the meeting and come right back in, then we'll get through live right away. Can we try that?
We could try that. Certainly, I'll do that.
Okay. Just close that meeting window, and then I'll bring you right back in as soon as you can log in. Our apologies for the technical difficulties, friends, but what Mike has to share is valuable enough that we want to make sure that you can see him and hear him. So I see it, he's back in the meeting, and Mike, we'll have you start your mic and camera, and we'll have you take it away again.
Aha.
That's much better, Mike. Okay.
Great.
It's all yours. There's the PowerPoint, and we'll let you get back to your slide and continue where you're at.
Right. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that slightly scary moment when you lose your connectivity. So the first question that I wanted to explore is why research? In general, research is not a very popular subject and one that people avoid if possible. In the case of students, it is for many a necessary evil, something they have to do in order to complete an assignment or dissertation. I must confess that over the last 5 years, I found myself fascinated by the developments that have been taking place in approaches to research and surprised at how helpful they are for incarnational approaches to mission. So in this seminar, I want to challenge some of the commonly expressed reservations about research. First of all, the first reservation is that research is detached and scientific. We should build relationships and be being Jesus to people, not doing research. In response, I want to argue that the days when research was necessarily detached are long gone, and what we now find is that research methods help us to be much more thoughtful about the kinds of relationships that we develop with people. The second reservation is that research is subjective. It's too touchy-feely or partial and tentative. And people say sometimes we are interested in the truth and answers. This objection is, of course, the opposite to the one I just described above. The problem here is that my understanding of the truth and answers might make sense in my world, but not necessarily in the other people's worlds. So research and understanding of other people's worlds will help us deepen and mature our own ideas about what the truth is. The third reservation that you hear sometimes is that research is too academic. I'm not an academic. Let other people, the experts, do it. There is certainly a proper place for academic research, just as there is a proper place for academic study of Scripture. However, you don't have to be academic to do research. And if we are going to get to understand our neighbour better, some basic understanding of research will, I believe, help a great deal. The fourth reservation is that research is not spiritual. Surely we should be praying and discerning. Now, and my conviction is that research in a Christian context can richly enhance an incarnational spirituality, as well as a prophetic understanding of power and the powers. In fact, research will help our prayers and discernment, and it helps us, I believe, to stay connected to the reality that is around us. And it will help us to be more thoughtful about our own discernment. The fifth reservation is that some people might say, well, we already know our community well. We did some research when we first arrived and we don't need to do any more. My response is that communities are constantly changing and there are always new things to understand. And in addition, communities are very complex and there will always be more that we don't know than what we do know. Also, places that we know well are always the most difficult for us in reality to see and understand. So I found this idea that helpful: familiarity is the antidote to insight. So in some ways, the more familiar we are with a community, the more difficult it is to see what's really going on. I was on a research walk recently with a chap in Bristol, and he was extremely observant about what was going on around him, until we got to a particular point when suddenly the conversation switched and he started talking about his own life. And I asked him after about 10 minutes, I said, "What happened back there when you stopped looking around you?" He said, "Oh, well, this is a place where I walk often. I know this place. I come here with my wife." And because it was familiar, he stopped looking. And so I think sometimes the places that we're most familiar with are the more difficult ones for us to research. And the sixth reservation that you hear sometimes is, we spend too much time talking. Let's just get on with it. Now, there's a lot of pressure, I know, in mission to be seen to be getting on with the job and seeing results. However, there's a lot at stake, the potential to cause harm as well as to do good. Research is important because it helps us to be thoughtful and careful about the ways that we engage with people and communities. And again, in this kind of sense of preparation and research, I was speaking to somebody who was an aeroplane designer, and he said, made a comment that when the first aeroplane of a new design takes off, there's the same weight in paperwork on average as the plane itself. So that's maybe a good illustration about the need for preparation and research. So some reservations that I wanted to address. Let me present a model to you which we have found very helpful in our own situation, as it brings together research with mission, theology and Bible reading. When we meet here in Bristol as a small Christian community, especially in our first few years, most weeks we would have an open Bible laid out on an open map of our city with a burning candle on the map. In fact, you can see a picture of what we used to do just there on the PowerPoint. For us, the symbol is a reminder that we seek to live in two worlds, or two sets of stories at the same time. As followers of Jesus, we seek to participate in his story, and so we are attentive to the stories of Scripture, and this is represented by the open Bible. But we also live in a particular place in the 21st century world, and through our daily lives participate in the stories that inhabit our world, and this is represented by the map. To do theology or participate in mission is to live in both of these stories. That is, to live in the story of Jesus precisely in our own everyday world and all its various stories. The candle then speaks of the Christian community that, filled with the Spirit, seeks to position itself in the overlap of these two stories. I hope that's making sense to you. We're going to have a discussion break in a minute, so you can ask some questions if you'd like to. But this symbol draws our attention to the fact that just as we take great care in exegeting and reflecting on Scripture so that we can participate in its story, so too should we take great care in exegeting and reflecting on our community so that we can engage well with its stories. Or in other words, just as we seek to understand and interpret the stories of Scripture, so we should seek to understand and interpret the stories of our community. It is those skills of exegeting our community that I am talking about today. So research is about a rigorous way of engaging with the narratives and experiences of the daily life that goes on around us. One well-respected Baptist theologian, a guy called Paul Fiddes, said in one of his books, "I do not think it is possible to do theology properly without taking at least an amateur interest in the methods and results of ethnographers," by which he means researchers. So we've reached our first little discussion break. So I don't know if Stan, you wanted to come back and sum up any questions that are there.
Oh, well, I think, Mike, I guess one question I would have is you're sharing a model here for us in terms of researching and living into both stories. What are some other models that come to mind as well that you have worked with, or as you have engaged in ministry and incarnational mission?
I can see the my picture's frozen again, actually, in a rather strange pose. I'm sorry about that. I think one of the other models that some folk might have come across is the model of the pastoral cycle, or a model of practical theology, which is also very helpful, I think, in drawing together daily life and reflections on daily life, theology. It gives some room for some, if you like, some contribution from experts and from other sources, and then cause us to reflect on what we're hearing and how that is going to affect the way that we move forwards as a community or the way that we engage in mission. So that's another very helpful model, and in some ways it's really just another way of describing what I've described with our map and Bible model. But the reason I like the map and Bible model is it's so graphic and visual, and it's one that we sit around as a community, and it reminds us really of how to do theology and how to reflect on our journey together.
Yeah. The one thing I appreciated earlier was the resistors to research. Do you find that depending on the setting or the group, that one type of resistance tends to dominate over the others that you listed? For example, if you're talking to, say, more like church leaders and more higher church structures, do they tend to have some resistors that you tend to hear more of versus, say, someone in and actually a local context where their resistors may be different? What can you share from your experience?
Well, I think that's a good question. Actually, I need to reflect on it a little bit, but certainly I think there has been quite a sense of separation between what some people call academic and on the one hand, and the practical on the other, and that's quite I think an unhelpful separation, and it kind of caricaturizes sometimes where people are coming from. And so when people talk about research, they tend to think of the academic side of things. And what I'm wanting to do here is really to show that that's not the case, but there's some stuff happening in research that is really very much to do with what happens on the ground and can help us enormously. So I think, if you're talking sometimes with people who are involved in mission work, there's a bit of an impatience really to get on with stuff. But I think if we use other phrases, so I've used research in this seminar, but if we were to use other phrases, then generally what we're talking about is a great deal of interest, really. So it's partly about expectations and terminology.
Okay. We have Ryan shared that there's a good article about exegeting a neighborhood within a city by J.R. Woodward, and there's been affirmation of that article in terms of creating what Tara says a missional culture, and it's a recommended read by these folks. So,
great.
Well, let's go back and share. I'll let you share. Continue on with your presentation and look at some comments and questions that will come from that.
Right. Are you happy to stay with the frozen picture?
I can stay with the frozen.
Sorry, everybody. You might want to look away at this point. It's not a very helpful picture. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So the next little section that I want to look at is what is research. In the first section, we looked at why research, and this section, we want to look at what is research. And I have a few points to go through here. So first of all, research is about seeing. Simply put, it is about having our eyes opened to what is going on around us. You may be surprised that in the title of this seminar, I've included the word prophetic. And you might wonder about how the prophetic can be linked with practical research. Well, research methods are about learning to see what is not immediately obvious in everyday life. If you like, to get under the surface of the mundane and see meaning in the familiar. Going back to my model of the map and the Bible, seeing in the prophetic sense begins to happen when we let Scripture ask difficult questions to our own context or community, but also when we let our own context ask difficult questions of Scripture. In this way, we understand that the prophetic is not just about seeing Jesus, or not just about seeing the world. It is about seeing Jesus in relation to the world, hence both the Bible and the map. And in particular, it's about identifying the questions that arise when the two come together. In other words, research is about positioning ourselves as learners and listeners so that we are attentive to the world around us and to see what the Spirit is doing in it. We are, if you like bird watchers, poised and ready for something fresh to break into our horizon. In this sense, doing research or doing theology become a normal part of what a small missional community is about. Point number 2 about what is research. There are two broad approaches to research to consider when we're thinking about research and place. First of all is quantitative and also qualitative research. Quantitative research deals with numbers and measurement. It tends to focus on the general, and it is associated with a scientific approach where objectivity is valued. For example, the statistics that you can find on the government or local government website, which are especially commonly used in mission circles when they relate to multiple deprivation. We find that here in the UK a lot, that they are very popular. So that's quantitative research dealing with quantities. Qualitative research deals with words and narratives. It focuses on what is sometimes referred to as thick description. It tends to focus on the particular. It's associated with meaning in everyday life and culture, and subjectivity is valued. For example, we could think about researching the everyday lives of particular places, such as teachers in schools or nurses in a hospital. Quantitative and qualitative approaches may be used together rather than set against each other. Quantitative has an important role to play and is what many people think of when they talk about research. But today in this webinar, I'm going to focus on qualitative because I think that this has most to say about our situation and is generally less familiar to us. So qualitative research focuses on a number of things. First of all, on the experience of everyday life, which is what I want to focus on today. It is open-ended. It is like if you like, a detective story, not certain about what the outcome will be. It is careful and rigorous. Just because it's a subjective approach does not mean that it lacks rigor. It is also narrative-based. It seeks to connect with the stories that are embedded in places and communities. And lastly, this kind of research works well when the researchers involve themselves in an extended period of immersion in the community to be researched. It is described by one author as a deep hanging out, and I like that sense that our research or incarnational living is about deeply hanging out. The third point I wanted to make is that our research of the particular or local situations often offers a critical global insight. By using qualitative approaches to research to look deeply into small situations, important insights can be gained into the way that life is working in the larger scheme of things. Let me give you an example. Spending time, for example, doing research by observing the reception area of an advice centre and hearing the stories of those who are long-term recipients of social benefits shows a great deal about the positive and negative impacts of the benefit system as a whole, in a way that the deprivation statistics don't say much about. If we consider the recent changes to the benefit system that's happened here in the UK, these stories give a very different picture to the government's unemployment statistics. Researching the particular or local situations also plays an important role in, for example, challenging the way that policies are rolled out across a variety of areas on the basis that if something is true in one place or works well in one place, then it must also be so in other places. This assumption happens in areas as diverse as implementing social policies, such as education or health policies, but it also includes the way we often approach mission. We see that a lot here in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere around the world. We see so many mission and church planting methods rolled out across a country because they have worked well in one particular place, and the assumption is that they will work well in other places. So take, for example, deprivation statistics across our own city. If you look at the third most economically and socially deprived places in Bristol, some of these areas will be in the multicultural inner city, and some occur in estates around the edge of the city. A statistical analysis might suggest that they face similar problems and challenges of deprivation. But if you were to spend time researching the stories you hear in a food bank in both of these places, you would hear very different stories and learn that what deprivation means in one place in the inner city is not the same as in the other. The way of engaging with people in an outer city estate will thus be very different to those in a multicultural inner city area. I hope that makes sense to you. We have another stop in a moment for questions, but the fourth point I want to make here is that research makes things more complex, which might not be very good news. The accepted view of the world is challenged and transformed through research. It might seem a bit of a no-brainer to say that research is about looking for that which is not immediately obvious. This means that we come to a situation with the understanding that the things are likely to be much more complex than they seem at first sight. This is, I believe, a very important part of research, and especially of research and the prophetic, especially if you want to understand more deeply about engaging with power and the powers. Most of the time, we operate out of a common sense view of the world, and it is this common sense view that keeps things ticking along normally. Qualitative research places the common sense view of the world under scrutiny, and the view of the world is challenged and transformed because of it. And then the last point before we stop for another quick discussion break is that research knowledge is by definition partial and temporary. It is important to note as a final point here that all research is only partial and temporary. That is, we can never claim to have a complete view of things. People and places, society and culture are very complex. Also, they are constantly changing. Good research will help us to see more than we did. Good research will help us to see more than we did before. But it will also give us a sobering sense that this world we live in is complex and that we should approach it with some care and humility. Maybe it'd be good just to take a little discussion break there again. I don't know if there's any comments that people would like to make or questions.
Mike, just want to share a couple things that have come up. One is Vanessa. She shared that they were so blessed to have you lead a group on spiritual mapping, which was absolutely brilliant. She comments, I saw so many opportunities to reach out to the community by using the spiritual mapping method. Highly recommend it in order to get to know the area and community through the eyes of God. Could you share a little bit about that experience and what it all involved in case there is someone here that may not be aware of what is meant by spiritual mapping?
Yes, thank you. That's a good point, actually. I'm just trying to remember the exact time we did that. But the next section, in fact, the rest of this webinar, I'd like to look at methods, really, and perspectives. And so we would talk a bit about this, and especially about walking. So if I don't cover the particular points that Vanessa was referring to, then can we come back to that and tackle it again?
Also, Esther raises a question. She brings to us. She says, do you have experience of doing this where the audience is broader than the church planting team? If using participatory research methods, then presumably The purpose of the research is also about facilitating the community and discovering its story.
Yes, and that's really important. And the fact that I want to emphasize that the whole of the kind of research that I'm thinking about here is about out in the community. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. But really, it's about researching the world around us and also our own position in relation to that world. So it's about, if you like, understanding and establishing a much deeper connection and awareness with those that are around us, particularly people who are very different from ourselves. And so I think in that sense, research is about discerning our community, but also being in a conversation with those around us, so that it's not just me or a group as researchers are discovering things, but it's like that we discover together with those around us. And so it's a participative
The
event.
wonderful thing about doing these webinars is that we have people from that are located in different parts of the world. And Craig shares with much of the talk of church planting and incarnational worship, as well as location in different parts of the inner cities. Are you familiar with the new monasticism and the community springing up in the United States, or even to share what is happening in your area in Bristol or around the UK and other parts of Europe?
Yes, I mean, certainly, I'm aware of the new monasticism springing up in the States, and I've heard from friends a bit about that. And certainly that is happening here in the UK as well. So there are a variety of kinds of groups. Some of them come specifically under the umbrella of the new monasticism, and others would position themselves slightly differently. But I think a very exciting movement of people who are seeking to get quite deeply embedded. And a lot of those are touching into areas that are marginalized, and specifically wanting to engage themselves in marginalized areas. And I guess as I think about research, and a lot of the stuff I want to talk today here about is specifically really wanting to engage with those groups who find themselves in quite challenging situations and want to understand more deeply how to connect with those situations. And so I'm arguing that just as we seek to connect with Scripture, so we should also seek to connect with our community. And that as we use tools of exegesis for the Scripture, we should also have at our disposal some practical research tools that will help us to understand our community better. And so I think these small communities, whether they're kind of new monastic or Anabaptist or whatever background they're coming from, are ideal places to be doing this kind of
Vanessa
research.
has a question sharing, how often should we carry out our research?
Again, we're going to address that one specifically in a moment. And my argument just in advance will be that research is something that becomes a journey. It's something, it opens up really a way of spirituality and a way of community living that could be ongoing. I think it's helpful to have little phases when we do some intentional research into some specific areas. So there's a kind of both and, sometimes intentional over, say, a couple of months, and other times we see it as an ongoing part of our journey. I would like to convince people that it's something we should be doing all the time.
Let's go return, and Mike, and allow you to continue to share with us, and then we can open it up for some more comments and questions.
Great, thank you. I'm sympathizing with you as you still watch my strange picture. So sorry about that, folks. The whole of the rest of the webinar, I want to focus really on this question of perspectives and methods. Perspectives are about how research is approached. It would often be referred to as methodology. And methods is about practical ways of doing research. You will see on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint that, that perspectives are listed in yellow and methods in blue. I'm not going to cover all of these areas today, so don't worry if we don't seem to be getting through them on time. We need to remember that the approach I'm suggesting here to research can involve a whole range of methods. So it's not a question of choosing just one, but of mixing them together in complementary ways. Also, just as a reminder, that this is a brief introduction to research, and that part of the role of our new organisation, Urban Life, is to have someone come and journey with you, well, that's if you're in the UK, I guess, as a team, so that you can learn this stuff by doing it in your own area. And we'll hopefully have a lot of stuff on our website that will be launched in the autumn on the same subject. So first of all, research as a journey. Quite often, research is presented as a clear step-by-step process, which takes a few months to do. Then, so the thinking goes, having done your research, you can get on with the action, which is the real job that you are here for. This is a rather, I think, limiting and somewhat unhelpful view of research. A more helpful way of thinking about research, especially for incarnational communities, is in terms of a journey. Doing research is like setting off on a journey, not quite knowing where you will end up or what you will encounter on the way. This is the kind of journey where things don't happen in a tidy or planned way, and you need to be ready to deal with the unexpected things as they come up. In reality, you can expect the whole process to look a bit messy. The journey will change you, and it will change your perspectives. It will teach you to be more attentive and thoughtful, and it will open your eyes to things that you had not seen before. Importantly, it will also equip you to journey better in the future. In this sense, the journey of research never really ends, but becomes an ongoing part of our journey of discipleship, mission, and incarnational living. So I want to point to one method here, and that is the method of reflective practice. One of the key things about this approach to research is to understand that none of us comes to a place or situation as a detached observer to find out the truth about a place. It is not like we are sitting on top of a tall building, looking down on things to observe what is going on, and then to draw a map of how the community was organized. Nor is it like looking through a microscope and describing what we see. Rather, we are discovering things by being immersed in them. And as we get immersed, we need to recognize that we come with our own already established views and understandings about how the world works. We often come with complicated and mixed up experiences and emotions, with anxieties and prejudices about different kinds of people. The challenging thing is that most of us are quite unaware of our own complex inner worlds, so that research becomes in part a journey of growing in self-understanding. Reflective or reflexive practice is about discovering more about who I am in relation to the place I am researching, and understands that this place that I'm researching is going to show me some things about myself that I haven't seen before. There may be prejudices against certain groups of people, stereotypes that I hold in my thinking, weaknesses that I didn't know I had. The area may call attention to gifts and character strengths I hadn't identified in myself. It may open up the presence of Jesus to me in ways that I've not known before. We thought about this a lot in terms of, in our own community, in terms of the exhortation of Matthew chapter 7, where it says, "Why do you notice the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly." In doing incarnational research, we need people and spaces which will help us to reflect. And an incarnational or intentional or monastic community can be a key place for this kind of reflection. In our own community, in our own community, we regularly ask these questions. I've just got up on the screen. We have a set of questions that have grown up really out of our own story. So some of the language might be a bit odd for you, but these kinds of questions that we have found helpful for reflexive practice. Where is the gift in a difficult experience this week? That might be a question. That's a question somebody asked just in our mealtime the other day. Where has the Spirit been nodding at you? There's a story there. Where have you glimpsed God this week? What has been bothering you? So thinking about the encounters you've had this week, what are the things that are bothering you? What in your life is coming alive? When through this week or this last month will you definitely write about something? And this might be thinking about, for example, when we on reflection have been too stubborn. And in our experiences or encounters this week, what has made you more hopeful? These kinds of conversations can bring important insights, and we have learned that it is really important not to let these go, but to hold them before God and in prayer. A helpful way of doing this is to keep a community journal, which sometimes, most often, someone takes home each week and then reads, writes up what they've heard in our gathering and then reads it out the following week. It's also helpful to keep a personal journal to help you reflect on the things that you're encountering, and to have a trusted person outside of your immediate context who will help you reflect on these things. So that's research and experience. The next bit I wanted to talk about is that was researcher's journey. I wanted also to talk next about research and experience. This emphasizes that our everyday experience can be a really important part of good research. And if you live or work in the area you're researching, some of the most fruitful research observations and insights can be gained just from everyday encounters. It is not that we have to set aside an official time when we go somewhere and do research. Rather, this is about introducing a level of attentiveness to what is going on around us in our own everyday lives. Research is in part about trying to get under the skin of everyday experience or familiar places. There is a sense that we get so familiar with something that we don't really see what is going on. We just see what we expect to see. As we learn to be more attentive to the everyday life that is happening around us, we begin to notice things that we've not seen before. Some researchers who are not from faith backgrounds are so impressed by this sense of seeing things that they write about it in terms of the divine or revelation. I've had a number of experiences where something has just leapt out at me when I was least expecting it. What begins to happen is that some of the most striking insights don't happen when we're doing formal research, but when we're off guard or absorbed in something else. For example, something we see on the way to the shops, or a chance encounter with a person, something we notice at work. Of course, experiences are subjective and happenstance, and in this sense, they do not present a complete overview of a situation or a place. But encounters like this can open up insights for us that statistical information or questionnaires could never do. So some methods. How can we go about this in practice? I find it really helpful to carry a notebook in my back pocket. A very simple thing, but even having a notebook there kind of reminds me to be more attentive. The reason for the notebook is to write down your impression as soon as you can. The idea here is not to think about or analyze what you see, but the aim here is simply to capture what has impressed you. The sight, the sound, the smell, the emotional sense, a phrase or a narrative or a small story, the way that people have reacted together, those kinds of things. You can do some thinking and reflection later on, but the idea of attentiveness is to catch the impression. I read about one researcher who was doing some research in a restaurant, and he was serving as a waiter, and he had to keep rushing out to the toilet to make notes in his little notebook because he was so excited about some of the things he was seeing. I'm sure you won't get that desperate. The second method, which we may have touched on earlier, but that I found very helpful, is that of walking. One really great way of researching an area is walking. You can go into in a small group, or you can go by yourself and walk around the patch. Put aside 3 or 4 hours for a slow wander, leaving plenty of time to hang around as you go. You could think of this as intentionally hanging out. Make sure that you take at least an hour to sit, preferably in a coffee shop, I guess, and to talk together about what you've noticed after the walk. It's at this point that most of the seeing, or most of the sense of seeing actually happens. So I've been with so many groups that when we sit down afterwards and say, what did we see, what were we seeing? People say, yeah, I saw that, but I never noticed it. And so it's that sense of being able to reflect at the end of the walk. And again, take a notebook or record the conversation can be very helpful. The thing with walking, like this is that it presents us with a different kind of experience, as most of us drive or go by bus. And when we do walk, it's only in places that we're familiar with. And most of us, when we're walking, if we're honest, are not very attentive to what is going on around us. So walking in the way I'm suggesting takes us into a new territory physically and culturally. Sometimes it can be good just to set off without any kind of agenda, but this can be a bit difficult, and quite often people find they don't really know what to look for. So here are some ideas that you might want to use when you're walking your patch. First of all, walk across your city or town and try and see a sense of where the boundaries and barriers are. Do you notice yourself crossing from one kind of place to another? Are there roads or railways or walls that make it difficult to move from one place to another? Are there cultural boundaries in places that exclude some groups of people? So, for example, in shopping malls, exclude homeless people. And you'll notice the city at night often tends to exclude women. So these are quite difficult things to see, but if you wander around and begin to look, it's surprising what you can connect with. Another walk you could do is to look at the way the city is connected globally, or the town that you live in is connected globally. What are the signs that there are global connections at work? For example, are there businesses that connect globally? Are there migrant workers? Are there currency exchanges or corner shops that offer currency for certain countries? Is there globally sourced food? Well, yes, there certainly will be. Where is it coming from? What kinds? Are there transport hubs? Are there parts of the city that are less connected or more connected globally? And what kind of effect do you think that has? So you can do a walk on global connections. Another approach is to understand the changing rhythms and the character of the city. So the idea here is to plot a route across the city, say between 3 and 5 miles, and walk it at different times of the week and at different times of the day and the night. The sense of a place can really change between, say, 9 a.m. on a Monday morning and 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, or at 1 a.m. on a Saturday night. One memory for me was on a nighttime walk through our city. The big shopping mall we walked through was like a ghost town, and you could see the nighttime workers there doing some repair work and cleaning. In what was really a depressing environment they had to work in. They were unseen people working at night. Just half a mile further up the road, a local shopping street where there's a strong Somali community, there was a butcher and a hairdresser that was still open at 1 a.m. and surprisingly, the hairdresser was full. I'm not quite unsure what was going on there, but it was an eye-opener to me to see how that part of the city changes at that time of night. So, Stan, if you're happy, we could stop for another discussion break there.
Oh, this is very good, Mike, and it's generated some conversation. As you were sharing about the reflective practices, Tara Hornbacher raised that she said we call that seeing through our own lens when we observe experience. And so that is one comment that is there. And then Dan Poole shares, it is much like the interesting phenomena of how our brain fills in missing letters or words when we are reading a familiar text. Almost like there's assumptions that we make about the context that we're in because we just keep looking at the same data over and over again. Mm-hmm. Is there, how would you respond to, and then also Gandalf identifies himself as Howard Worley, and let's see, where did that go? It disappeared on me. Oh, Howard, yeah. He says, I like your introduction in observing life, yep. And how do you separate yourself from the context you are observing in order to get detachment?
Yes, I think so. Some very interesting questions there, and I think some of this focuses around the idea of becoming embedded in our community. And so we could, going back to an earlier question, we could think about, for example, having a greater awareness of the lens that we're looking through, if you like, our own cultural or value lens, so that we're looking at something through our own eyes, and other people wouldn't necessarily see that in the same way. But what I guess I'm talking about is not only that, but it's about a deeper relational connectivity, or if you like, an incarnational involvement. That means not only do I need to be aware of the lens that I'm looking through, but I also need to be aware of who I am within that. And that as I come into a context and seek to be open-hearted and reflective, I discover things about myself. And if you like, the stereotypes or the prejudices or the anxieties that I might hold that need addressing. And so a very, I guess, a slightly trite example of that would be many people who were driving into an area. I used to live in Peckham, and it happens here in the estate as well, would be quite anxious about leaving their car or coming to visit. And some people actually wouldn't come to visit us because there would be an anxiety. And that might say something about the place, but it might also say something about us as people. And I think that that's a very helpful way of engaging with what the Spirit is doing in our lives as much as it is engaging what the Spirit might be doing in a community. I think about detachment is also then a very good question, because I think as we get immersed in this stuff, people might ask, well, where is the objectivity, or where is the rigor in that, or how can we stand back? And I'm suggesting that in this kind of approach to qualitative research, or to, if you like, incarnational or embedded research, there does need to be some rigor in the way that we reflect. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but it almost is another session in itself. So I'm wanting to give some appetizers here, but certainly there are some methods we can use and some tools that we can use that will help us to stand back and then look and reflect at what we're seeing. And that kind of ability, if you like, to be immersed on the one hand, but also to stand back on the other, I think it's a very important rhythm to introduce into, if you like, an incarnational research lifestyle.
It's almost like we have to be aware of those pieces of information, or those things that we see that we continue to be drawn to, and to be aware of that. And when you're doing, say, for example, in doing the using the method of walking, and you're with a group, how do you have the group identify what are the things that they are most prone to be drawn to, that they're drawing that data from, so that way that they can take, in a sense, a more objective approach?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that one of the ways of doing that is by using a number of different methods. So what I'm talking about here is I've got 5 or 6 different methods on the perspectives and methods screen before you. And one of the very good ways of introducing rigor into research is to make sure that we're using a number of different methods. And also we can draw in quantitative research as well, so that what we're doing is we're gradually building up this big picture. But what I want to emphasize is that often the insights we get, the surprising moments, the sense of revelation that comes is something that we really need to take note of. And I think most often in research, we tend to shy away from those kinds of moments. And in this idea of keeping a notebook and writing things down and trying to capture the moment, what I'm encouraging is a real attentiveness to those things. It's often like lifting the corner of a carpet and seeing what's underneath, or suddenly seeing, as somebody described it, the flash of a kingfisher's wing. You know you've seen something, but you don't quite know what it was you saw. And the ability to be attentive to that moment, and then, if you like, put it in the mix with other things, is a way of getting under the surface of what we normally take for granted. So again, just to go back to the challenge here, I think the challenge for a lot of research is to try and get beyond the familiar, or to see within the everyday a more complex picture that will enable us to understand what really is going on under the surface. And that's the challenge, I guess, that presents itself to me, seeing beyond the familiar, seeing more.
David from Denmark writes, this is for you. What did you learn about your community in Bristol, and how did it shape your church?
Well, the community that I'm in here is what we call in the UK an estate. It's a slum clearance area from the inner city, which was happened back in the 1930s. And there was a big new housing complex built on the edge of the city. It's very spread out. There's about 15,000 people, and it has very high levels of deprivation. And and it has a very bad reputation in the city, so it's spoken about in very detrimental terms. And so, as we've lived here, one of the things we've learned very strongly is the stereotypes that are presented in the press and the way that people talk about the place is just not real. It isn't true that people who live on the estate suffer very strongly from stereotypes. I've been talking with somebody, a number of cases, but talking to somebody just recently who said that they were from an estate, and when they came off the estate to go and get a job, they weren't given interviews because you're from the estate. And so one of the things that our eyes have really been open to in engaging in research is to see how different the caricatures and stereotypes are to the reality, but how people really suffer because people treat them as if they are true to stereotype. And so it's much more difficult if you're from our estate to get a job or an interview. It's more difficult to be treated fairly on public transport or by public services. There's a heightened suspicion about you. You're generally thought to be not so trustworthy, more lazy, not so responsible, more inclined to violence. And all of those kinds of things, when you begin to dig down, they're just not the case. Those things are not true. They're stereotypical things.
Before we get to
one
Han's
example
question, we need to just take a momentary break to just put up our poll about the webinar, both the presentation and content, and then also to offer information for those that are with us to check in for continuing education units. And so, Enton, if you will come in and share that information, and then we can continue with the conversation.
Stan, can I just say, so you're aware, I have another section to go through as well.
In that case, why don't we let you do that, Mike, before we get to the wrap-up? So we'll take you back to your sharing and to let you finish that section.
Great, thank you. And I've just lost my place research and experience. Sorry, guys. Hang on 1 second. I just lost my place. I think I've got to hear. Yes, I have the next section then, and I'll be quick on these, is research and others. This is just to take 5 minutes or so. Often research involves being with people who are from completely different backgrounds and circumstances to those of our own. And for some of us involved in mission in marginal places, the people that we are with will quite often be on the edges or the margins of so-called mainstream society. we might say that in relation to each other, we are people of difference, or that we are other. Sometimes research has been presented as going to a certain location or place to find out about or discover the person of difference, or the so-called indigenous population. So, for example, we might think, let's go out to an estate and find out about estate people. In this approach, the person doing the research is seen as the expert with the knowledge and research tools, and people being researched tend to get objectified as a research project. This approach has all kinds of problems, not least of which is that it creates difference between us in a way that assumes that the researcher has all the power and the researched community has none. A different and much more helpful way of approaching this is to observe what is going on at the meeting point of myself and the other person. We can focus on areas such as what is characterizing the meeting, what is happening in the space between myself and the other person. Rather than trying to find out about the other person and their world, I am attentive to what is going on in between us. If you like, what understanding is arising at the point of connection. This approach is a relational or incarnational approach to research, and is a recognition that knowledge or understanding is not sourced primarily in me or in the other person, but is found in the place of connection or of meeting. Let me give you an example. On our estate, we have found that there is a very strong culture of insiders and outsiders. But we are growing to understand that this is not simply an estate thing. It is not, in other words, about the culture of the estate itself. Rather, it is about the way in which the whole of society or the whole of our city works. So the shock of research is that I find that I too am inescapably part of the social system that identifies people as insiders and outsiders. Therefore, I find that in doing research, I'm not seeking to understand some place over there called the estate, but I'm seeking to understand what goes on between me and an estate, so-called an estate person I'm meeting and spending time with. I'm finding that there are significant boundaries between us that neither of us can understand by ourselves. But if we are attentive to the space between us and the clashes and struggles that go on in that space, then we begin to find rich insights, much more so than a whole set of questionnaires, I think, would do. One of the results of this for us is that when we listen to the news or we hear politicians speak, we begin to realize how deeply prejudicial some of the views expressed are about so-called estate people. People on estates are often portrayed as undeserving, benefit scroungers, and language like the hard-working poor is often used to reinforce that impression. On one of my urban walks, I got to talking to one chap on the other side of the city who actually came from the estate and moved out, and he said that they are all scum up there. You know what it's like. Scum rises to the surface, and that is what the estate is about. The point I'm making is that these kinds of ideas are being expressed all around us, but it is only as we have been more attentive to our own situation that we've noticed how complicit we ourselves have been in sustaining them. This idea about being attentive to the space between us is where perspectives and methods of research become very closely aligned with the theology and practice of incarnational living. And two scriptures spring to mind at this point, which I've got on your screens there. One is where 2 or 3 of you have gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. And the second is in Ephesians chapter 2, for he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall that is the hostility between us. These verses draw our attention to the fact that it is the presence of Jesus himself that fills the space between people of difference and breaks down barriers that normally divide. He is in the midst, or he is in between us. Therefore, from a Christian point of view, research isn't something we do and then put aside so that we can go on and do the spiritual stuff or the real job of mission. Rather, research opens our eyes to see people differently and to see that the boundaries that divide us are being bridged by the Spirit. It also opens it also opens us up to the arrangement of the powers that operate in a place and keep people apart, and it makes us attentive to what Jesus is doing to overcome those powers. I want to say one method here, which I called a deep hanging out, the phrase I've used before, but more officially is called participant observation. And this is about getting deeply involved and immersed in the rhythms and routines of everyday life in the place you are researching. You need to think carefully about the kind of place you want to get involved in and how you are going to get access. It could be, for example, a children's or youth group, a school, a food bank, or a local project of some kind. It is most ideal if you are already involved in an organizational place that you want to research. It means you can come to this job or project as a learner and observer. As a starting point, begin to get a log of what you are noticing around you. This is a really exciting area of research that we can explore more through our open life connections, but it's actually quite a big one here for this evening, so I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I have put the title of a book you'll find there, Mike Krang and Ian Cook, Doing Ethnographies. It's a bit of a technical one, but it's a very good introduction to this kind of research. And then the last area I want to touch on briefly is research and questions. When we think of mission or evangelism, we often think in terms of bringing answers. Our starting point is often that the gospel is the answer. The difficulty with this is that we are not always sure what questions we are answering. Research is, in part, helping us to identify the questions. And I want to note at this point that it's interesting that Jesus constantly used questions or provokes questions in those around him. For example, in Mark's Gospel, which seems to be structured around questions, Mark's involves a whole series of questions, and the central section of the Gospel is about the question Jesus asked to his disciples, saying, "Who do people say that I am? And who do you say that I am?" I find it helpful to think of two kinds of questions. The first kind of question helps to set the direction and focus of research. For example, one of the questions that I've been focusing on is, why do certain patterns of deprivation get so strongly rooted in our estate? And that question has helped guide the direction of research. The second kind of question is the kind of question that arises as we get more deeply embedded in incarnational research. They are questions which really get under the surface of everyday life. And if you like, they expose some of the darker underbelly of life. Jesus seemed to be a master at provoking these kinds of questions. He asked questions like, he provoked questions like, who should we pay taxes to, Caesar or God? Or why could we not cast the demon out? Or who then can be saved? One of the important questions that has arisen for us critically in our situation is, what does hope look like on our estate? Or what hope does Jesus offer here? So when we have come across people who are chronically ill and have no chance of getting better, unemployed and have no hope of ever working, have fragmented and broken relationships, we have to ask, what does hope look like in these kinds of situations? And I just want to say that the method here is about semi-formal interviews. These are a great way of getting a broad sense of a place or an issue and can help identify areas for more focused research. A semi-formal interview is a good research method and is really just arranging with somebody to sit in a room for between 30 or 90 minutes and asking them to talk with you about a particular subject. There are a number of things to bear in mind when you're doing this, and so just outlining them here. Make sure that the person or group you are with feel comfortable and relaxed. Do it in an informal setting where they feel at home. Let them know how long it will take and keep to time. We've gone over time here, so I'm not a very good example. Make sure beforehand that they know what this is about and why you want to do it. Let them know about confidentiality and check with them that this is okay. Ask the person or the group if you can record the interview or take notes. It's really helpful to have some record that you can reflect on later. I can't emphasize that too strongly. Do some preparation so that a clear idea of the main theme you would like to explore and some ideas about the kind of prompting questions that you will help introduce and direct the conversation. We need to note that a semi-formal interview, you're not working through a list of questions, and therefore you can make the most of any way a conversation develops and follow the leads that are of interest. You can arrange, of course, semi-formal conversations with all kinds of people in your area, and this will help you get a deeper perspective of things. Focus groups are also helpful. This is where you gather a number of people from similar situation and ask them to talk about a specific area. This can be a great way of digging more deeply into an issue and also connecting more strongly with the community. Focus groups could also include people from a variety of backgrounds to share their own experience on a particular community issue. For example, the way unemployment is working in the place, or the way that community facilities help in an area, or conflict between different sections of the community. I just want to underline that these kinds of conversations can be extremely valuable in terms of research material and gaining understanding. There are so many times when I wish I had my notebook with me or that I'd recorded something. Also, so much of the insight comes later on when you do some of the work of analysis and reflection, but that's a subject for another time. So I'm going to, because of time, I've got a bit here on researching stereotypes, and I'm going to skip that section and just say as I conclude that this is the end of the webinar, but there is another opportunity for questions and discussion. Through this webinar, we have, of course, only introduced the subject of research, and I hope that that's whetted your appetite. The purpose of Urban Life is to support you in beginning to explore some of this stuff in more detail in your own situation, and we will be developing resources over the next year that will help you to do this.
Thank you, Mike.
Please do feel free to be in touch with me
to
personally if you want to follow through on anything that we've
information
covered today.
that we'd like to
Stand
put
up
up
to you.
regarding the continuing education, and then also an opportunity for people to respond with the poll of today's event.
Thanks, Dan. I'll keep my part pretty short. We have polls that we invite you just to click, and thanks for the one or two of you that have started us out. Just give us a little bit of feedback. First, how helpful was the presentation, the content, and the learning that Mike provided? And then second, how well did this webinar format serve you? For those of you that are looking forward to continuing education units, here's instructions, and there's a link, and I will post that into the chat window as well. And so you can follow that link after our discussion is done to be able to request your continuing education. And then Stan and Mike, I'll turn it back to you all to continue questions and discussions while people are filling out those polls. So take it away.
Mike, I want to go back to a question raised by Hans a few minutes ago. He says, Mike, thanks for the very interesting ideas. As a student, I like your focus on research. However, I also struggle with the connotations with the word. How would you relate research to discipleship as a way of learning?
That's a very good question, and I also struggle with the connotations of the word, as I tried to explain in my original objections. It does raise, kind of variety of thinking for people, which often has unhelpful associations and seems in many ways unspiritual. And so I like words like attentiveness. So I think to be attentive, I think to be thoughtful. I think ideas about the prophetic and being grounded are also very important. And so it seems to me that this idea of research is about having our eyes open to what's going on around us, which is a deeply biblical theme. One of the places that it's really rooted is in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is told to go and preach, and so that while seeing they will not perceive, and while hearing they will not understand. And that's a theme that's brought up through the Gospels and is a central theme for the way that Jesus explains his own ministry. And you see that part of the walk of discipleship, this is especially clear in Mark, but you can see it in other Gospels, is to talk about the way in which Jesus travels with his disciples so that their eyes are opened. And if you look at Mark chapter 8, you see that it's the beginning of the section when Jesus goes on the road to Jerusalem. And just before they set off, he rebukes his disciples. He says, "Do you not yet see? Do you have eyes, but are they not opened?" And there's a tenfold rebuke in there about them not being able to see. And then he goes to heal the eyes of a blind man. You remember he has to pray for him twice. It's the only time when Jesus has to pray for somebody twice. And the understanding I have of that is it's if you like, a narrative of discipleship. And what Jesus is trying to do with his disciples, he's trying to lead them on a path where their eyes are opened. And when not only to who he is, let me put it like this, their eyes are opened not just to who God is, but their eyes are open to the fact that Jesus is Messiah, that he is God incarnate on the earth. And so there's this profound connection between seeing who Jesus is for the world, or who Jesus is in the world. And in order to do that, I think we need to understand who Jesus is, and we need to understand the world that we live in with all its powers and all its power and intrigue that goes on. And so research really, I think, is a deep part of discipleship. It's deeply spiritual. It should be part of a rhythm of life that helps us to have our eyes opened. I think one of the implications is to read our Bible and do theology in context, in our own context, and is to let the difficult questions that emerge from our own context really be honestly asked to the Bible, and not to be too afraid that the Bible or our theology is not going to stand that kind of buffeting. So this kind of research is about trying to evoke honest questions from our context and address them to Scripture. And for me, that's a rigorous way of doing theology, and it's one I pray that as the Holy Spirit is present will open our eyes to see amazingly who Jesus is, but who he is in our own context. And so, research may be not a helpful word in that sense, but I think it's
raises a question.
I think the disciplines
she
of
says,
research
I agree,
are
Mike, as you were addressing this question, and says, could this be explained, or asked, could this be explained as a spiritual discipline to pay attention, which
yes, it could be. I mean, I think I like that idea, Tara, of that. I think I love the idea of attentiveness as a spiritual discipline. Rowan Williams wrote a bit about this in terms of discipleship, and he said it's a bit like being a bird watcher. He said, and he quotes a bit of poetry that I can't remember offhand, but he said it's like when you're a bird watcher, you go out and you sit all day. If you're doing it in Britain, then you'll be sitting in the rain. You sit under an umbrella all day in the rain, and sometimes nothing happens, but you sit there poised, ready for something fresh to break into the horizon. And he talks about a bit of poetry that speaks of the flash of a kingfisher's wing. And I don't know if you've seen a kingfisher, been out on a river, but often with a kingfisher, you just see a bright blue flash. And if you're attentive, you see that. But if you turn away, if you're not very attentive, you miss it. I was using that as an illustration on discipleship in church one day, and a friend of mine came up afterwards. He worked for the BBC, and he said that one of his colleagues had been out the previous day, and his aim had been to get 30 seconds of film of a kingfisher, and he left at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was out all day. He got back at 6 o'clock. He got 38 seconds of film of the kingfisher, and he told my friend that when he got home, he just put his feet up on the settee and to have a little doze, And he woke up the next morning at 8 o'clock. He slept from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. And what he said was it was so tiring sitting all day waiting for a kingfisher to appear. And the discipline of being attentive is not an easy discipline. It isn't just kind of hanging around and vaguely watching. There's a discipline within it. And what I like about the disciplines of research is I think that they help us to be more attentive. And so, for example, even the thing of just walking around the city with a notebook in your back pocket, it's a reminder that we're looking outwards and wanting to be more attentive. So I love the way that attentiveness
thanks you for the answer and also the direction that you're taking on research. Vanessa asked a question about getting onto urbanlife.org and was wondering if the address is correct or if you have some information that you could share.
Yes, sorry, urbanlife.org is not up and running yet. I should have said that at the beginning. We hope to have it up and running by the beginning of September at the latest. So yeah, watch this space and I'll send out an email to everyone on our mailing list as soon as it's up and running. If you're not on our mailing list, drop me an email.
I put my email address up there on the comment box. Observation is that as you were talking about research and many of the things that you said, it reminded me of a piece of work that is fairly popular here in the United States, especially in the areas of psychology, sociology, and business, and that's the work by a gentleman by the name of Chris Argus, and who has, it's not necessarily anything really new, but he's given a name to it as the ladder of inference. Some people call it the assumption ladder, that as we do research, from what I'm hearing you talk about this, is that it's not only looking into the context that we have, but it's also, in a sense, self-examining the data that we have been using and the experiences that we have been using to draw our own conclusions and beliefs, and therefore then lead us to action. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to say thank you for everyone that is still here with us. We appreciate your participation and the conversation that has happened through the chat box, and also to Mike, just a wonderful job of presenting making this presentation on research and helping us to understand its much broader context, and also really tying it into discipleship and what that means for us in our communities. And so, Mike, thank you, and Enton for your support. And for those of you still with us, if you want to hang on to the conversation and continue to share questions and observations, you're welcome to do so. But good night and goodbye to wherever you may be, or good afternoon, or we just want to thank you again. So.